The scalar theory of everything is a paradigm shift and a causal model of the universe. This is the paper. This video starts with the foundation, forms a universal equation, applies the equation to the current observational problems. These are: I calculate a theoretical universe temperature, which no one else does. The galaxy rotation curves are still a problem because the dark matter has not been found. Asymmetric RCs are a problem because nobody knows why. Galaxy redshift because the correlation coefficients are very poor. Periodic redshift, again, no model. The Pioneer Anomaly has 10 characteristics, of which only one has been explained. Planet 9, they're still looking for it. Coherent light for particles, which has not been done before. And a model of a photon, which gives us diffraction. The transparent mass experiment, which rejects wave models of light. And gravity is the asymmetry of the magnetic field and some others. I start with Newton. Newton established a major physics advance that was confirmed by predicting the late return of Halley's Comet. Newton identified three characteristics of bodies that have been identified as three characteristics of mass. After Newton, then I examined experiments and observations without intervening models. For example, I don't concern myself with Doppler shift for the galaxy. It's a galaxy redshift, not a Doppler shift, if you see the difference. I form a model to explain all the universe. Postulates that the stuff of the universe is continually being emitted through sources at the center of spiral galaxies and ejected through sinks at the center of elliptical galaxies. The stuff of the universe are HODS, which are discrete magnets that cause a depression in the plenum. They are two-dimensional. Plenum, which is like an ether, continuous, that supports wave actions, and the interaction of the HODS and plenum. Matter bodies are emergent assemblies of HODS and plenum. The huge issue facing physics today is that the foundations of the big, the classical, and the small size scales are inconsistent with each other. The STOE is justified because it corresponds to all scales. The model many of the problem and has made predictions which were later observed. The three characteristics of mass, or bodies. Weight. The plenum force acts on the surface of the HODS. The inertial mass is the property of the plenum required to support waves, and gravitational mass is the effect of HODS on the plenum. A body has HODS held in place by the plenum. Newton's model works by defining forces that are exerted on bodies by an ether, then adding forces vectors to arrive at a single force that predicts the body's measurable motion. Note, forces, not energy. Newton suggested a reductionist step in theory by positing an ether whose divergence exerted a force that caused gravity and that caused diffraction, and by positing corpuscles as light as components of matter. That is, support for the ether and corpuscles was because the model could explain several diverse observations, then known but mysterious, rather than by direct observation. Today, this might be known as a theory of everything. I started the STOE by returning to Newton's path and then jumping forward to the quasi-steady-state cosmology of Hoyle. This is the reference. The QSSC suggested a source of the stuff of our universe at the center of galaxies. It solved the rotation curves of spiral galaxies and other current problems. This is the cluster structure according to the STOE. We have source galaxies, elliptical galaxies, sources and sinks. Sources emit plenum and HODS, which then form hydrogen, which then flows outward from the spiral galaxies. Some of it forms suns and flows back inward to nova. The iron core of the nova then forms black holes. The black holes fall into the center of the spiral galaxies. Now the plenum density is very high, and this crushes the black holes. And this is seen by X-ray bursts, which are unaccompanied by other radiation. These have been noted. They have been connected to black holes, but people do not still understand what these X-ray bursts are all about. Another output of the nova is heavy elements, rocks, some of which go back in as solar systems. Others flow outward to the intergalactic space and then flow back into the sinks, where some of them come in hot, they flow out, they cool down, and they flow back in. This is the observed cooling flow. This is the cluster structure. We have spiral galaxies around the outside and elliptical galaxies in the middle that are sinking all the matter that these spiral galaxies are emitting. Binney and Merrifield for a description of galactic astronomy. The universal equations formed. This is the plenum density at some point. You'll notice it consists of components from the source, the sink, and matter. The numerator here is the strength of the source or sink and the gravitational force of the matter, of the HODS. You'll note they are all inversely proportional to the radius. That is, it's three-dimensional space, not four, 3 dimensions and only 3 dimensions. The rho, the divergence of the rho, dot product with the normal of the HOD surface, forms a force on the HOD. The force on the HOD divided by the inertial mass of the HOD then gives you the acceleration. You'll note all the universe causes the force or directs the path of a dropped object. This is a Machian theory. It is a causative theory. This looks at the B-band luminosity of sources divided by the B-band luminosity of sinks within some distance. And we increase the distance. And you'll notice that as the distance gets around 150 megaparsecs, the ratio here approaches 2.7. This sets the constants in the previous equation. The STOE also accepts a negative feedback principle. That is to say, fine-tuned parameters are controlled by a negative feedback loop. The problem is finding the physical feedback loop. For example, universe temperature seems to be fairly finely tuned, and this is of the microwave background radiation. Now you know what I said, microwave background radiation, not cosmic. No proof exists that it is cosmic. The source increases heat, sinks decrease heat in proportion to the mass in the elliptical galaxy. Heat of the galaxy cluster, heat in, heat out. Apply the heat equations. This is the long-term average temperature, and you get this curve. We are approaching the long-term average temperature, which works out to be the Euler number 2.718. If you look at the mass time it takes to flow from the source galaxies to elliptical galaxies, you can calculate that to be at about 5 billion years ago, and that at about 14 billion years ago. This is increasing temperature of the universe and increasing volume along with the increasing temperature. Rotation curves. The focus has been on flat rotation curves in the outer part of some spiral galaxies, but rising and falling rotation curves also exist. These are falsifiers of dark matter. There's my paper. Asymmetric rotation curves. This is the rotation curve in the outer part of the galaxy. Some continue at that velocity. On the other side of the galaxy, the rotation curve continues at a slightly higher velocity. That gap right there is known as an asymmetric rotation curve. 20 years ago, there was quite a lot of investigation into what causes the asymmetric rotation curve. They didn't come up with a model, so these days, they don't really talk about it too much. What happens in the papers is they just simply average the two sides and say that's the rotation curve. The three forces acting on matter outside the center of the galaxy. Here's the rotation velocity. This is the inward force of the gravity. This is due to the luminosity or source strength, and this is the force exerted by a neighbor galaxy. I use one neighbor galaxy on the matter in the target galaxy. The results: I sampled 105 spiral galaxies, which is all I found. That is to say, I didn't choose any galaxy, only what others have chosen. 16 had Cepheid star distance calculations, which are very accurate. 49 of the sample have published asymmetric RCs. The little dots you see in some of these are the data. The lines are the STOE calculation. In the dark matter hypothesis, you go from a declining rotation curve, which should be Keplerian and normal Newtonian. You add dark matter to that kind of a curve and you get a flat rotation curve according to the dark matter hypothesis. But how do you then get a rising rotation curve? Well, you get it by adding more matter. The difficulty is this galaxy and that galaxy are known as low surface brightness galaxies. These have less matter than the average, and therefore this is a falsifier of the dark matter hypothesis. Here are the equations for 4 galaxy characteristics. This part is the target galaxy characteristics. There's the neighbor galaxy, and you will see that the 1 sigma uncertainty level is very good here, 5%, 2%, 3%. This is very good. Now, galaxy central mass and central velocity dispersion have been found to be related to outer galaxy parameters. The difficulty here is the accepted model, that is to say the infall model of the Big Bang theory. Matter flows in, but we see that hydrogen and other stuff flows out, so in spiral galaxies. So according to the standard model here, then there should be no connection with galaxy central mass and central velocity dispersion. The STOE holds there is because from the center comes the rest of the galaxy. B-band luminosity has been related to these outer galaxy parameters, and so I look at it and I find that there is a very good relationship between the two, the same as before. Target galaxy, neighbor galaxy, and the 1 sigma is 6% and 3%. That's very good. Galaxy redshift. This data is from the Key project. They use the Doppler shift to determine the redshift theoretical value. They calculated a Hubble constant of 70 kilometers per second per megaparsec. So here we see their theoretical or calculated variable versus their measured redshift. This correlation coefficient of 80% is poor. These galaxies are within our cluster, seem pretty good. These galaxies are from another cluster, and that is not so good. 80% overall is poor, considering what this Hubble constant is and what the Cepheid variable distance variable stars is. It's the base of the astronomy distance ladder, and it's a base in the Big Bang theory. It's very important to have a correlation this far. This is the STOE derived equation. There's the redshift. I have 5 constants, but I have 32 galaxy data points, so it should be pretty good to get that. The D, P, and F are characteristics of the plenum along the line of sight as the photon from the target galaxy comes to us. Those characteristics then modify the photon. And here's my calculation. I have a correlation of 88%, which is much better, but even so, I have that one and that one and that one being galaxy outliers. And this is perhaps not too good to have outliers like that. Halton Arp, in his book Seeing Red, suggested quasi-stellar objects are actually new spiral galaxies closer to us than what traditional science thinks they are. If you add these back in, the correlation goes to 93%. I recover the Hubble law. There's the X factor. There's the distance for these different galaxies. You recover the Hubble law and the correlation is 93%. I recover the Hubble law and I get 110 kilometers per second per megaparsec. The periodic redshift is another Halton-Arp discovery, if you will, in that the redshifts appear to be somewhat periodic. This is an elliptical galaxy in a galaxy cluster. I plot as 0 here where it is, and then I look at the other galaxies in that cluster here and note the redshift of them. And this is the angular distance out from this galaxy. Here's the same thing for distance, but I'm using relations such as Tully-Fisher and other relationships to find distance. Now you note these two distributions do not look the same. So galaxies beyond the elliptical galaxies are having their redshift reduced to get to here. Galaxies closer to us than the elliptical galaxy is having their redshift increased to form that kind of a structure. Now, you'll note that some models, such as the bubble model, which suggests that the Earth is at the center of the universe, or the finger of God kind of model, is explained here because our redshift that we measure is along our line of sight. If we change our line of sight, this will remain the same. So it doesn't matter where we are, it's always going to be along our line of sight. Hence, we're not the center of the universe. But it is an effect that the STOE has explained. The Pioneer Anomaly. All 10 anomalous characteristics, not just the one of accepted physics, is explained by the STOE. The Pioneer Anomaly is measured as a blue shift in the radio signal. It is not measured as an acceleration. It's measured as a blue shift. There's my paper, 2006. The universal equation is applied. It considers the masses of the sun, planets, and with Saturn's moons, and the source galaxy in our galaxy. Although the sources, sinks, and matter provide a constant level of plenum density. The STOE model, like with galaxy redshift, the universal equation causes a frequency shift in the radio signal from the spacecraft. This implies an Earth direction of the anomaly. All other models suggest a Doppler shift, like the accepted model of galaxy redshift, hence the acceleration terminology and the assumed sun direction of the anomaly. The equation for the C is as before. I take 2 of the constants set equal to 0 because these are galaxy distance oriented. So for the Pioneer 10 spacecraft, this is the data. The data is sampled over a 10-day period. Now, this is a little long because I calculate my equation for a given hour and minute of a day. So I look for the data at the beginning and at the end, and hopefully the data point will be in the middle. This is for the Pioneer 11 spacecraft, data versus my calculations. The correlation coefficient is 93%, which is very good here. The cosmological connection. One of the 10 characteristics is noted as a cosmological connection, for which the standard model has no explanation. Here I apply the distance versus that uppercase X factor noted before. You can see the data is very good. There's the distance, there's the Hubble constant. I calculated 106 kilometers per second per megaparsec. The galaxy redshift and discrete redshift are the same phenomena as the Pioneer anomaly. The reason for the cosmological connection is in the universal equation. You will remember that those things are proportional to the inverse distance, the inverse radius. And that's what gives it the cosmological connection. So predictions. I wrote the paper in 2006. In 2006 and 2005, there were several models as to what could be causing the Pioneer anomaly. So the Pioneer teams started to look into this, and they looked into it by looking at the data of the Pioneer 10 before they detected the anomaly. It was a different computer back then, and so they had quite a bit of work to do. They finally published their data in 2009 and 2011, and what they found was that the flyby encounters were present but insufficient to detect the anomaly. Several of the models suggested the anomaly started with the encounters. The STOE agrees with that. Secondly, they said the Earth-directed anomaly was preferred. Now, this to me is kind of interesting. The data said it was Earth-directed, but the standard model at this time was that the anomaly was caused by the heat in the spacecraft, a thermal reason. So to say that it is preferred or to say that it is directed to the Earth is actually a rejection of the standard model. Secondly, the STOE has a decaying anomaly, remember the 1 over r kind of relationship, 1 over distance relationship. And the thermal anomaly explanation suggests that there should be a constant level of acceleration for the spacecraft as long as it was being used. The accepted model is one of a temperature effect, which is because of the use of the electrical power spacecraft. The New Horizon mission was originally planned to investigate model differences by shutting down during the mission and then let it go for an extended period of time. Now, this part of the New Horizon mission was abandoned, because here we are later on, around 2008 or so, when the New Horizon was about to fly. Most of the models had been abandoned except for the temperature effect model. That was the only remaining accepted model. So the only thing that that test could do would be to reject the accepted model. So it was abandoned. They didn't do the test. Planet 9, another prediction found in the Pioneer paper, which noted the orbit of Pluto was elongated with aphelion directed opposite to the source, like the RC cause. No, okay. Planet 9, nowadays called Planet X, is a hypothetical mass in the Kuiper belt that causes the trans-Neptunian bodies to have an unexplained, long, elongated orbits. These orbits seem to be elongated in the direction of Orion, which is opposite from us than Sagittarius A is. So the STOE suggests Pioneer anomaly, and the hypothetical Planet 9 phenomena are linked to a common cause, the source being at the center of our galaxy. The key to the small is what is a photon, wave or particle, and the diffraction and interference experiments that have been observed. Some experiments do suggest a particle model, such as the photoelectric effect. If the photon is going to be a particle, then it has a huge problem. The huge problem is coherence. Young's experiment, which was a double slit experiment, was taken to suggest wave-like light because in the early 1800s it seemed the only explanation of coherence was waves, and this then became the stumbling block. In 2003, the Afshar experiment rejected the Copenhagen and other interpretations. That's the wave-particle duality thing. The STOE explains how coherence occurs for particles, and that's what we're going to go into. The transparent mask experiment, which we're going to go into, also rejects all wave models but the STOE. The STOE developed a CROI computer simulation program which produces coherence, interference, and the experiments that reject the wave models of light. Coherent light is, by definition, light that produces a diffraction pattern on a screen after passing through a slit or pinhole. Coherence is obtained by light by going through a pinhole, which is the first mask in Young's experiment, by light traveling a long distance, such as from a star, as seen in the airy disk pattern in telescope images. That's what Newton used, and from a laser, that's what I use. This is the STOE model of a photon. It is HODS, structured in a column, held in a column because of the plenum, and that these things are actually small magnets, north-south, etc. They move in a direction with no surface area, that is to say they move that way. And as they move, they cause waves, just like a boat going through water, in the plenum. Each one causes a wave. Now the math here is the same as the linear array of dipole antennas. It's been well developed, you can look it up. So these things are like dipole antennas, and they form a wave in the plenum. The plenum wave goes out, rebounds off the atoms in the mask and the screen, except where there's a slit. No rebound waves from the slit is how the waves then help direct the photon where it has to go onto the screen. This is what one photon does in the plenum. In its direction of travel, which is here, it reduces the plenum density considerably. The math, that is to say the linear antenna array, produces other low points in the plenum density, and I've labeled them A, B, C, and D. I start with photons positioned randomly and traveling in the same direction in the computer simulation. The Bohm interpretation held that each photon has a definite position and momentum. However, the Bohm interpretation had a problem with diffraction and interference. That is, it required a pilot wave, but he didn't know the origin of the pilot wave. Now the STOE looks at each color of a photon or of light causes a different minimum spacing on the mask. So a different energy causes different momentum, but that means that the photon must be the source of the wave. So I do the simulation. I've labeled the different directions here from the previous graph. These are minima. You note the photons are lining up along these axes. Now, if you place a screen and put a mask hole here, you'll see there's photons, avoid, photons, avoid, photons, avoid, etc. So we're going to do that. These dots that you see here and up here are where my simulated photons go. And on top of that, I plotted a Fraunhofer equation plot on top of that, and you'll see that the equation is very good match for where the photons go on the screen. You'll note that between the two first minima on either side of the peak, roughly 80, a little more over 80% of the light is supposed to be in that, according to Fraunhofer, and about 80% of my photons in the experiment are in this zone also. It's a very good match. Another thing you can do with a computer simulation is trace one photon at a time through the experiment. And then kind of here's a bunch of runs. Each one is one photon going. The photons coming in tend to go towards the upper end or toward the mask. Now this has been noted by experimenters in that they have seen that as light approaches a lens or the mask, that they do seem to deviate their path very slightly just before entering a lens. This is known but unexplained. The other thing you'll notice is it appears that close to the slit there are more photons going, with fewer going in the center. This also has been known as brightness ever since Young's time. The ones passing closer to the upper edge of the slit are directed opposite the center line of the experiment, so we then have the center peak and the diffraction fringes. The simulation produces a very good fit for actual results, and here you can see the program is discussed here. This is the transparent mask experiment. A laser, an opaque mask, which is here, and then a glass plate, which is then going to have a slit in it, and then we're going to look at the image. Here's the paper. The fourth step is to put a nail between the mask and the glass plate. And this nail is going to block the central maxima peak. So here's the results. A is without glass. That's the diffraction pattern from the first mask. I put a glass plate in without a slit, and you see it's the same distance measurement between the minima. Then I place a slit in the mask. Now the way I do this is I just take two pieces of glass and put them close together, about a ½ millimeter or so. And you get an interference pattern. And there's a little expanded view of this area right in there. The fourth step, as I noted before, is to place a nail so that the central maxima disappears, is blocked. And yet the interference pattern is the same. That is to say, if you measure the distance between the minima and the number of fringes, and that, you get the same in both this and this. Now, the nail can't be causing this. Certainly there's no light going through the slit, but the nail we've added can't be causing this because the minima distance are the same. Okay? The same as up here. See, that's 14 millimeters. So from here to the center of that is 7 millimeters, and that's what we measure here. The nail can't be causing it because the nail is further away, and distance here does influence where the minima occur. So the nail is not causing it. So the slit must still be causing this interference pattern, but yet no light through the slit. That's what rejects the wave models of light. That is to say, the only way you can sense that slit there is to be according to the STOE model. There's a trick to placing the nail. If you place a nail in the middle of the light you will get a diffraction pattern back in the nail. This is well-known physics. If you place the nail such that the edge of the nail is right at the first minima on either side, there will be no diffraction pattern behind the nail. These are other papers. I discuss inertia and find that the mass inertia of matter belongs with the plenum and not with the HODS. The STOE explanation for ether wind, I discussed the Miller and the Michelson-Morley experiments. The reason I label it the plenum and not an ether is because the ether models assume that the ether can have a wind. The plenum cannot have a wind, for it has no HOD characteristics. The STOE model of the electron spin 1/2. This is the Stern-Gerlach experiment. You'll notice that an electron structure, which I give in another paper, includes magnets. So the HODS are magnetic, the electron is magnetic, and it's the magnetic electron interacting with the magnets of the Stern-Gerlach experiment that gives the result of the experiment. It is not spin orbits. Spin, the word implies some kind of rotation, angular momentum, and it is not a spin, it's magnetic interaction. I look at electric charge. DeSangro in 2012 measured the speed of a Coulomb wave to be very much greater than the speed of light, and therefore I place it as a plenum effect. The relation of the Ampere's law in the Maxwell equation is the Ampere law is wrong, and this is an experiment which shows it's wrong. Here's another one, does the same thing. This one takes a look at magnetic fields in Maxwell's equation, and it concludes there are two types of fields. One is permanent magnets, and the other is from current. So that Maxwell's equation treats them as the same is incorrect. Here's a structure that I use to evaluate magnetic field strengths of magnets. It's got an upper support which moves vertically. The lower support I put another magnet on, and it's directed to a scale. By moving this up and down, I can plot force exerted versus distance. There are 5 papers. This one came about because Andre Michaud published a paper where he looked at repulsion of magnets. I was intrigued, so I did my own with my own experimental fixture, as you saw, and saw things which suggested to me that the magnetic field may actually be a gravity field, only it's very weak. I looked at particles in that structure experiment, and I looked at electromagnets. Electromagnets do not produce the same results that permanent magnets do in that experiment. Then I looked at atomic structure. The current model of atomic structure has a problem. They assume the electrons are in an orbit held in place by charge going around a nucleus. Well, that means the electrons are under constant acceleration. That should emit radiation. It doesn't. No radiation has been found, and so that has been the fundamental problem with current model of atomic structure. Now I notice that when an electron changes orbit, it emits or absorbs photons. And with that, people have been attempting to figure out how an electron absorbs or emits photons when changing its position relative to the nucleus. Well, in my view, that it emits photons implies to me that photons are part of the structure. And going from a larger orbit to a smaller orbit, you're emitting a photon, which is part of the structure. And that discusses what a magnetic atomic structure can be. In the final paper, magnetic field evolves to be the gravity field, and here's how. This is a plot of the data in the final paper. You'll notice that there's two different structures of magnets here, and the two different structures supplies that there is a little gap here in the strength of the poles. One pole is slightly weaker than the other, and there's a difference here. This is how it would work. If you have a HOD, high plenum density on this side, low plenum on that side, the magnetic streamlines are like that, and this is like you would find with iron filings on a permanent magnet. But some of these streamlines on the zero plenum density side do not terminate on the other side of the HOD. They just go on, and this then becomes the gravitational field. Okay, this is pretty radical, and I'm not really comfortable with it, to tell you the truth. I would like confirmation. Can somebody else do these experiments and see what you think? Especially someone in the southern hemisphere. I'm in the northern hemisphere. Maybe what I'm detecting is northern hemisphere related. Other recent speculations, the magnetic field can also cause the strong and weak nuclear forces. That is to say, the magnetic field is the one gut force. Except a fractal self-similar principle allows us to model the strong and the weak, as that paper shows. Because life is part of the universe, survival is the only moral goal of life, and a scalar theory of everything model for steering humanity's growth. Thanks, folks.